The borrowed wool coat was already stiffening at the collar when the two men turned their horses around and rode back down the switchbacks without a word. They left her standing on a shelf of bare rock, above a valley she had never seen, her bundle at her feet, the wind pulling at her hem, the temperature dropping with every minute. The sun moved closer to the peaks. She was 22 years old. She had $4.80 pinned inside her petticoat. The rest of her savings, $6.60, had been taken from a tobacco tin behind the flour bin by hands she would never be able to name. The rancher's wife had told her she was being sent to a family over the ridge who needed a girl for the winter. The trail should have gone east. They had ridden north and west all morning. Willa Garrett had watched the drainages, counted the switchbacks, read the angle of the sun against the shoulder of the mountain the way a woman named Dorcas Pell had taught her to read it, years ago, in a kitchen that smelled of drying sage and tallow. Dorcas was 7 years dead, but her teaching was the only thing still keeping Willa's feet moving through snow that broke under her weight to the thigh. Half a mile off the ridge, in a fold of granite, where the wind could not reach, she had seen a low, dark roof from the trail, an hour before they abandoned her. She was walking toward it now, counting her breaths in fours, not hurrying, because Dorcas had told her that hurry in deep snow was another word for exhaustion. Not stopping, because to stop on that shoulder in that wind was to sit down and never stand again. The shack was 12 feet by 16, squared timber gone silver with decades of weather, a box stove on river stones, a stack of dry pine behind it, a tin of matches with a screw lid. She lit the fire the way she had been taught: shakings first, splits crossed above them, and only when the flame held did she sit on the edge of the bunk and let the shaking come. Then the candle flame leaned toward her from a seam in the floor, and Willa knelt, and her fingers found 3 boards cut shorter than the rest, with nails driven sideways so the heads would not show. She pried them loose. Below the floor, 5 earthen steps led down to a plank door set into the mountain itself. Carved into the wood in careful upright letters, 6 words: "To whoever finds this, go gently." She was 22 when they left her on the winter trail above Sparrow Ridge. No family waiting below, no coin worth counting in her pocket, just a tin locket at her throat, a borrowed wool coat on her back, the kind of cold that dries the inside of the nose before a person draws their second breath. The 2 men who put her there rode down the switchbacks at an even pace, neither one looking back, both of them certain the snow would finish what they lacked the stomach to do themselves. What none of them knew, what Willa Garrett herself did not yet know, was that half a mile off the ridge, set into a fold of granite where the wind broke, before it reached the south-facing wall, stood an old line shack with a pine plank floor. Beneath that floor, sealed behind 5 earthen steps, a root cellar had been waiting 80 years for someone exactly like her to find it. Willa Garrett came into the world in a 2-room house on the flats below Sparrow Ridge during the heat of a hard march. 4th child, only daughter. Her father, Roscoe Garrett, hired out to cattlemen his whole working life, moved other men's herds across other men's grass, never owned a foot of ground under his own boots. Her mother, Maeve, Seth, died of milk fever the summer Willa turned 7. On a morning so bright, the light through the window fell across the bed in a square that did not move. For the full hour it took Maeve to stop breathing. 3 older brothers scattered before Willa reached 10. The eldest went to the rail cruise east of the divide, sending back wages for 6 months before the letters stopped. The middle boy signed on with a freight outfit, running the low desert country, got his name on a manifest that went south in October, never appeared on one coming north. The youngest, Lyle, rode out with a horse string, headed for the northern ranges. He wrote twice that first winter, short letters in a hand that pressed too hard on the pencil, then once more in spring, a single line asking Roscoe to send his wool vest if anyone was coming through. Nobody came through. The vest stayed on its peg. Lyle was not heard from again after his second winter in the north. Roscoe did what men of his kind did in those years. He left the child with whoever would take her, rode out to the next outfit that needed hands, sent back what money he could when the work held. So Willa was raised in pieces, 6 months at one household, 8 at another. She learned early how to be useful in a stranger's kitchen, how to wash another woman's dishes without chipping the good ones, how to hold her tongue at a table where she was fed but not spoken to. She learned the particular silence of a child who understands she is being housed, not kept. The one place she was not held as a stranger was the small holding of a widow named Dorcas Pell. Dorcas kept a pole-fenced garden on a quarter-acre clearing at the foot of the ridge. 11 laying hens in a coop she had built herself from split cedar. A dry goods stall she ran on market Saturdays at the crossroads settlement below the timber. She was near 60 when Willa first came to her, a stout, square-shouldered woman with knuckles swollen to the shape of walnuts, a jaw set like the flat side of a hatchet, a habit of speaking only when speech would carry weight. Whole days passed in her house without a sentence. The silence was not cold. It was the silence of a woman who believed words cost something, the same way firewood cost something, the same way a candle cost something, the same way everything that kept a person alive through a winter on the ridge cost something that could not be gotten back once spent. Dorcas took the girl in 3 separate winters, between the ages of 9 and 15. Each time, Willa arrived with a bundle tied in cotton cloth. Each time, Dorcas set the bundle on the plank bunk without comment, pointed to the woodpile, handed the girl the short-handled axe. In those winters, Dorcas taught her. She taught her how to lay a fire that would hold coals through the night, the base logs set with their bark side down, the kindling crossed above them in a lattice, loose enough for air, the shavings tucked underneath where the draft would find them first. She taught her how to bank the coals in the morning, so the kitchen would still hold warmth at noon. She taught her how to render tallow from a beef suet in a cast iron pot set on flat stones outside the door, stirring with a peeled stick in slow circles until the fat ran clear. She taught her how to cure a haunch with salt, rubbed into the grain of the muscle, how to hang it in cold shade for 21 days without letting the flies find it. She taught her how to salt a hide stretched on a willow frame, how to read weather off the shoulder of a mountain, the way high cloud moving east meant wind by morning, the way a ring around the moon in November meant snow within 2 days. She taught her how to walk in crusted snow, weight on the ball of the foot, the heel set down last, the stride short enough that the crust would carry rather than crack. She taught her the names of the plants that grew above the tree line, yarrow for a wound that would not close, wild onion for a broth when the meat ran out, the inner bark of lodgepole pine, stripped thin enough to chew between one settlement town when the next was still a day's walk. She taught her without ever putting it into a sentence that a woman who could keep her hands busy could keep her mind whole, that grief, if it had to live somewhere, lived best in the work, that the body's memory for a skill outlasted every other kind of memory a person carried. The only object Dorcas ever gave her outright was a small tin locket on a braided horsehair cord plain as a nail head, unadorned except for a scratched initial on the back. The letter D, carved with the point of an awl or a finishing nail, shallow enough that a person would miss it unless they turned the locket over in good light. Inside, folded into a square, no bigger than a thumbnail, a piece of paper. On the paper, in Dorcas's careful sloping hand, 2 words, "Be steady." Dorcas did not explain the locket. She set it on the table between them after supper, on an evening, in Willa's 14th year, pushed it across the pine with one swollen finger, went back to her mending. Willa picked it up, opened it, read the 2 words, closed it, put the cord over her head, tucked the locket beneath her collar. Neither of them spoke about it, then or after. Willa was 15 when Dorcas died in her sleep between one Saturday market day at the crossroads below the ridge. The stall had been set up the Saturday before, soap wrapped in brown paper, bundles of dried sage, a crock of pickled beets with a cloth over the mouth, all of it waiting for a woman who did not wake up Monday morning. Willa was the one who found her. She came through the door with an armload of split pine for the stove, saw Dorcas on the bunk with her boots still on, one hand across her chest, the other hanging off the edge of the mattress, fingers curled. The room was cold. The fire had gone out hours before. Willa set the wood down. She did not call out. She crossed the room, pressed 2 fingers to the side of Dorcas's throat, held them there long enough to be certain. Then she pulled the blanket up over Dorcas's shoulders, the way a person tucks a quilt around someone who is cold, because the body does not know what the mind already understands. She built the fire back up. She heated water. She washed Dorcas with a cloth wrung out in the basin. working from the face down, the way Dorcas herself had washed the body of a neighbor woman 2 years before, while Willa watched from the doorway. She dressed her in the clean cotton shift from the bottom of the cedar chest. She laid her out, straight on the bunk, with the hands folded. She combed the gray hair back from the temples with the tortoiseshell comb. Dorcas had kept on the shelf above the washstand since before Willa was born. When the burial was done, 4 neighbors, a borrowed shovel, the ground still soft enough in the clearing. Behind the henhouse, the neighbors took back their chairs, their lamps, their covered dishes. Willa walked the 4 miles to her father's boarding room with the locket at her throat. She did not take it off again. By the time she was 22, Roscoe Garrett had been dead 19 months. A lung sickness brought down from a high camp, where the air was thin enough to split, a man's breathing open like wet wood. The small wages he had left behind a leather pouch under a floorboard, the savings of a man who had never earned enough to call it saving, went to bury him. What remained after that covered a doctor's bill, a store account, a square of pine board with his name cut into it, by a man who charged 50 cents a letter. Nothing was left over. Willa was working as a hired girl in the household of a rancher named Harlan Sutfield, whose spread ran along Willow Branch below the ridge. She kept his kitchen. She kept his laundry, the copper boiler on the back porch, the lye soaps she made herself from tallow drippings, because the store-bought kind cost 11 cents a bar. She helped Corinne Sutfield with the 2 small children, spooning porridge in the mornings, washing the little ones' linens when the fever came through in October, rocking the cradle with her foot while she kneaded bread, because a kitchen girl learns to work with what is free, which is mostly her own body, doing 2 things at once. She was paid in room board, $3 a month. She saved what she could in a tobacco tin behind the flour bin, in the pantry coins, set in flat against the pot so they would not rattle when someone reached past the tin for the flour. She believed, as young women of her circumstance were taught to believe, that if she was steady, useful, quiet, the work would carry her forward into something better. It was a reasonable belief. It was also the belief that put her on a bright cold morning in the 2nd week of December, on the winter trail above Sparrow Ridge, with 2 men who did not intend for her to come down. On the first Monday of December, Harlan Sutfield rode into the yard, from 3 days at the stockyards in the low country. He did not come into the kitchen for his supper. Willa heard him talking with Corinne in the front room for a long time, the low-level tone of a decision already made, being explained to someone who had not been part of the making. Not a discussion, a briefing. Corinne's voice rose once, then dropped, then did not rise again. Willa went on, wiping down the stove, setting the bread to rise in the 2 loaf pans near the warming shelf. Dorcas Pell had taught her that a person listening for their own name in another room hears only trouble, never the whole shape of it. In the morning, Corinne Sutfield came into the kitchen, with her hands folded flat against her apron, pressed there the way a woman presses her hands when she needs them to be still. She told Willa, in the voice of a sentence practiced before a mirror, that the household would be reduced after the new year, that Willa's place could not be kept on. She did not look at Willa while she said it. She looked at the breadboard, at the salt cellar, at the calico curtain over the window, above the wash bench. She said, Mr. Sutfield had made an arrangement. Willa would be paid out her month, given a written character. 2 hired hands would take her over the ridge, to the settlement at Thorn Creek, where a family called Haddon was in need of a girl for the winter. They had agreed by letter to take her on. Willa heard every word. She watched Corinne's hands against the apron, the knuckles white, the fingertips pressed into the cloth, as though holding the fabric down would hold everything else in place. Yes, ma'am, thank you. A pause. Measured. When am I to leave? Thursday. Weather permitting. Corinne left the kitchen without waiting for more. Willa finished the bread. She kneaded it, shaped it, set the 2 loaves into the pans, placed them near the stove for the 2nd rise. Only when the loaves were in the oven, when the heat had sealed the crusts, when the kitchen smelled the way a kitchen is supposed to smell. On a Tuesday morning in December, did she go into the pantry. She took down the tobacco tin from behind the flour bin, opened it on the shelf, counted what was inside. There had been $11.40. 14 months of saving at $3 a month, minus what she had spent on stockings, a comb, a half pound of tea at Christmas, a yard of cotton for patching, $11.40, laid flat in the bottom of the tin. There were now $4.80. She stood with the tin in her hand. The pantry was dim, the shelves close on either side, the smell of flour dust, dried sage, the faint sourness of the vinegar crock on the bottom shelf. She counted the coins again. $4.80. $6.60 had been taken out of the tin by a hand that was not hers, at a time she could not name, for a reason she would never be told. She did not weep. Dorcas Pell had told her once, in a kitchen full of drying rosemary hung from the rafter pegs, that weeping in another woman's pantry was a thing a girl must never do. Not because the grief was wrong, because the pantry was not hers, because a woman who lets her tears fall in a place she does not own has given that place something it did not earn, something it cannot give back. Willa put the $4.80 into the small cotton pouch she kept pinned inside her petticoat. She put the empty tin back on the shelf, exactly where it had been. She went back into the kitchen. The bread was rising. Thursday morning came in cold, the kind of cold that turns breath to white cloth in front of the face. 2 hired hands were waiting in the yard, with 3 saddled horses, a pack mule standing hipshot behind them. Willa knew them by name, by little else. The older was Galt Tiernan, thin, long-jawed, 40, or past it, who had worked for Sutfield off through 6 years, without forming what could be called a habit of conversation. He had never once spoken to Willa at the kitchen door, except to ask for coffee, which he did with a single word, the cup already held out. The younger was Emmett Shale, 19, with a poor beard coming in patchy along the jaw, a nervous laugh that arrived at things other people had not found funny, a way of cutting his eyes sideways at Galt before every sentence, as though checking whether he was permitted to speak. Willa carried out her bundle: 2 dresses, a second pair of stockings, a wool shawl, a comb, a thin bar of lye soap she had made herself, a half loaf of bread wrapped in cheesecloth, a hard sausage. She had on her calico dress, her wool underskirt, her heaviest stockings, the borrowed wool coat that had belonged to Corinne Sutfield's brother before he moved east. Around her throat, under the collar, where the cold could not reach it, was the tin locket on its braided horsehair cord. Corinne came out onto the porch. She held out the written character in a folded envelope, arm extended, as though the distance between her hand to Willa's was a distance she needed to maintain. She did not embrace her. She did not wish her well. She said, "The Helms are good people," in a voice that had nothing behind it. The way a woman speaks when she is reading a line from a letter she did not write. Harlan Sutfield did not come out at all. Galt Tiernan took the bundle, lashed it to the pack mule with a rawhide thong, told Willa to mount up. She mounted the small bay mare they had brought for her, a short-backed animal with a patient mouth, the kind of horse an outfit keeps for errands that do not require speed. The 3 of them rode out of the yard at a slow walk, the sun not yet clear of the ridge, the frost on the fence rails, catching the first low light in a line of white sparks that ran the length of the corral. The trail up from Willow Branch climbs through pine timber for the first 4 miles, a steady grade that follows the creek bed before the creek bends south to where it disappears into a jumble of deadfall too thick for horses. Then the timber thins. The trail breaks into open switchbacks, running along the shoulder of Sparrow Ridge in a long north-bearing, traverse, the kind of trail a person rides with their collar up because there is nothing between them, the wind, the sky, except the ground they are sitting on. The morning was bright, very cold. The snow along the trail was old snow, packed hard on the shaded side, drifted soft on the sunny side where the wind had worked it into ridges that looked like the ribs of something buried. Willa rode behind Galt Tiernan, ahead of Emmett Shale. Neither man spoke to her. She did not speak to them. She watched the country as she rode. Dorcas Pell had told her once, standing at the edge of the pole-fenced garden with a hoe in her hand, that a person who does not know where they are is already half lost. Not lost in the way of panic, lost in the way of having given up the one advantage that costs nothing to keep. Willa counted the drainages coming down off the ridge from the west, marking the shape of each one, the wide one with the gravel bed, the narrow one choked with alder, the one where a rock slide had dammed the runoff into a frozen pool, the color of old pewter. She noted the burned snag at the second switchback, a single black trunk with no branches, standing against the snow like a post, set by someone who had forgotten what it was meant to hold. She noted the leaning fir at the fourth switchback, its root plate half torn from the ground, the trunk canted at an angle that said it had been falling for years without finishing the job. She saw the tracks of an elk cow with a single calf crossing the trail at the top of the pine timber, headed downslope for lower feed. She saw where a bobcat had crossed after them in the night, its prints, round, light, deliberateness pressed into the snow. The bobcat had followed the elk tracks for 30 yards, then turned aside into a stand of juniper. Willa noted the place where it turned. A predator that gives up a trail has found something easier, or something has spooked it. Either way, worth remembering. She saw once, far to the north, a thin dark line of smoke, standing straight up in the still air above a ridgeline she could not name. She could not tell what it came from: a cabin, a camp, a lightning-struck stump, still smoldering under the snow. She marked its direction against the peak behind it so she could find it again if she needed to. She kept her hands in her coat pockets when she could, out of them when she needed the reins. She flexed her fingers inside her woolen mittens every few minutes to keep the feeling in the way Dorcas had shown her, not rubbing, which costs heat, but opening, closing, the slow pump of blood into the fingertips that a person must do before the numbness sets in, because after the numbness, it is already too late. They stopped once near noon, in a small flat where the trail bent around a granite shoulder. A spring came out from under a rock in a black seam that ran across the snow, the water moving too fast to freeze. Galt let the horses drink. He gave Willa a hard biscuit from his own saddlebag without looking at her, the way a man hands a tool to someone standing beside him at a workbench. Not generosity, not cruelty, just the mechanics of a task. Emmett Shale laughed at something, he said quietly to his horse, then stopped laughing when Galt looked at him. Willa ate the biscuit. She drank from the spring with her cupped hand, the water so cold it made her teeth ache. She did not ask how much farther Thorn Creek was. She did not ask because she had understood, without allowing herself yet to name the understanding. The way a person sees smoke before they allow themselves to say fire, that they were not riding toward Thorn Creek. Thorn Creek lay east from Sutfield's ranch, a little south. They had been riding north all morning. The trail had carried west for the last 2 hours. The sun told her that. It had crossed behind her right shoulder before noon, which meant she was facing north. The drainages told her that. Every creek bed she had counted came down from the west, which meant the ridge was to her left, which meant they were traversing its western face. The tilt of the ridge above her left shoulder told her that a person heading east toward Thorn Creek would have the ridge behind them by now, dropping away. The ridge was not behind her. It was above her, still climbing. She got back on the bay mare when Galt Tiernernan told her to. They went on climbing. By the middle of the afternoon, they were above the last of the pine timber. The trees fell away below them like a dark skirt dropped around the base of the mountain, leaving the upper body of the ridge bare, exposed, the rock showing through the snow in long dark ribs. The wind ran unbroken from the northwest. It came across the open shoulder with a sound like cloth tearing very slowly, a sound so constant it stopped being a sound after the first minute, becoming instead a pressure against the left side of the face, a tightening of the skins, a pull at the collar of the borrowed coat. The sky had gone from bright to milk. Not clouds, a high, even haze that turned the sun into a white disk without edges, the kind of sky that gives no shadows, so that the snow, conned, the rock, the trail all flatten into the same pale plain. Depth disappearing, distance becoming a guess. Galt Tiernan drew rein at a place where the trail widened into a shelf above a long steep drop into a valley. Willa did not know. The valley ran north, timbered on its lower slopes, the creek at the bottom, a dark thread between white banks. Galt sat his horse for a moment, looking down into it. His jaw worked once, the way a man's jaw works when he is chewing on a sentence he does not want to say. Then he swung out of the saddle. He came around the bay mare without speaking. He reached up, set his hands at Willa's waist, lifted her down. His hands were careful, the grip firm enough to be steady, gentle enough to mean nothing. He took the reins of the mare out of her hand. Behind her, Emmett Shale was already at the pack mule, untying her bundle. He set it down in the snow at Willa's feet, the cotton cloth dark against the white, the knot she had tied that morning in the kitchen, still holding. He went back to his horse without looking at her. Galt Tiernan spoke. Not unkindly, not kindly either. The voice of a man performing the last step of a task he had agreed to perform. Mr. Sutfield asked us to see you over the ridge. This is the ridge. He paused. The wind filled the pause with its slow, tearing sound. There is a wagon road. 3 days' walk down the valley. North, it will take you to a rail town if you keep going. Another pause. Shorter. I wish you luck. He mounted up. He turned his horse. He did not look back. Emmett Shale fell in behind him, the pack mule's lead rope in his left hand, now the bay mare's reins in his right. The two men rode back down the switchbacks, the way they had come, the horses' hooves muffled in the packed snow, the sound growing smaller for a long time. Willa stood on the shelf above the drop, her bundle at her feet, the wind pulling at the hem of the borrowed coat, her face turned toward the sound of the retreating horses, the way a person turns, toward a lamp being carried out of a room. The sound grew smaller. It thinned. It became a rhythm. She felt more than heard the soft percussion of shod hooves on hard-packed trail, spaced by the length of a walking horse's stride. Then it became nothing. Willa Gareet was alone on the shoulder of Sparrow Ridge, with a bundle at her feet, $4.80 pinned inside her petticoat, a tin locket at her throat, the wind coming up. She stood where they had set her down. 1 minute, 2. She was not thinking. She was doing something older than thinking. Something Dorcas Pell had never named, because it did not have a name, the thing a body does, when it gathers itself before the work begins. The way a horse gathers its hindquarters before a jump. The way water gathers behind a rock before it spills over. She was becoming still so that she could begin to move. Then, she bent. She picked up the bundle by its knot. She settled the borrowed coat closer at her throat, feeling the tin locket cold against the notch of her collarbone. She turned her back on the drop into the valley. She knew where she was. She was above the last timber, on the west shoulder of Sparrow Ridge. The wind was out of the northwest. The pine line she had ridden up through lay somewhere below, behind her, to the south. She was not half lost. She was entirely found, standing in a place she had been reading since the first switchback, counting drainages, marking snags, measuring the tilt of the land against the tilt of the light. Dorcas's teaching had not been lessons. They had been armor. Willa was only now discovering what they were built to withstand. She remembered a low roof she had seen from the trail an hour before they crested the shelf. It had stood off the trail to the west, in a fold of the ridge where 2 granite outcrops made a shallow pocket against the wind, a dark set against the snow. Half a mile back, a little down. She had marked it because Dorcas had taught her to mark such things. A roof is a door, is a chance, is a night survived. She went back the way the horses had gone, following their tracks in the packed snow as far as the second bend. Then she left the trail. She cut down across the sheeted snow, on the traverse she had held in her head, stepping where the crust looked thickest, keeping her stride short the way Dorcas had shown her. The crust took her weight for 3 steps. On the 4th, it broke. She went into her knee, the snow closing around her leg, with a sound like tearing paper. She dragged herself out, shifted her weight forward, went on. The crust took her again, broke again. She went into mid-thigh, this time, the cold biting through her wool underskirt, the snow packing into the top of her boot. She kept the wind on her right cheek. She kept her mittened hands closed on the knot of the bundle. She did not hurry. Dorcas had told her that hurry in deep snow was another word for exhaustion. A person runs when they are afraid, walks when they intend to arrive. She did not stop. To stop on that shoulder, in that wind, was to sit down, rest the legs, let the cold settle into the muscles, close the eyes for just a moment. A person who sits down on an exposed ridge in December does not stand up. The light was going out of the sky, in a slow, even way that had nothing to do with clouds. The haze above the ridge was thickening, the white disk of the sun dropping toward the western peaks, the snow turning from white to gray to the color of old linen. Willa counted her breaths in 4s. In 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4. The counting kept the rhythm. The rhythm kept the legs moving. The legs kept the body warm enough to keep those legs moving. That was the arithmetic of survival in open snow, a circle that worked only as long as no part of it stopped. She came around the side of a granite outcrop, the rock rising above her, like the prow of something half buried in the ridge, its face black where the snow had not been able to hold. Below her, in the fold between the two outcrops, the line shack sat sunk to its eaves on the north side, its roof a dark wedge in the last white light. It was a low building of squared timber, no bigger than 12 feet by 16, set with its long wall to the south, its door in that wall. The logs were silvered to the color of driftwood, the gray that wood turns when it has been left to the weather for decades. The grain standing up in ridges, the surface hard as horn. The chinking between the courses was pale clay that had fallen out in long seams, so that the north wall showed dark stripes where the wind had worked through. The roof was split cedar shakes, laid double, half the ridgeline gone soft with rot, a slow sag in the middle, where a beam had given up its argument with gravity without quite losing it. A stovepipe of tin came through the shakes on the east end, rusted at the crown, braced with wire to a peg, driven into the ridgepole. One small window on the south side had been boarded from the inside with a piece of packing crate, the boards still sound. No window on the north. The door was 6 vertical planks held by 2 batten crosspieces, closed with a wooden latch on a leather thong. Gone stiff with age, Willa worked the thong with her mittened thumb until the latch lifted. The door came inward against a low drift of fine snow that had sifted under the gap, making a sound like a sigh held too long. Inside was dim dry, much colder than she had hoped, much warmer than the wind outside. She stood in the doorway, letting her eyes learn the room. The way Dorcas had taught her to learn any room, she entered for the first time, not by looking at what was there, but by looking at what the room had been doing while no one was in it. A room that has been empty tells its story in dust patterns, in the direction of cobwebs, in the places where mice have chewed, in the places where they have not. The floor was pine plank, wide boards laid tight, gone the color of tobacco, worn in a shallow track between the door and the stove. The stove was a small box stove of cast iron, no bigger than a bread crate set on 4 flat river stones. Its firebox door hung open. The firebox was clean, dry, no ash, no clinker, as though someone had swept it before leaving. A short stack of split pine lay in the corner behind the stove, gray with dust but sound when Willa pressed a piece with her thumb. A tin can of pine splits, shavings sat on the hearthstone. Along the west wall, a plank bunk built into the logs held a straw tick, gone flat brown, a folded gray blanket of coarse wool at the head. Above the bunk, 2 wooden pegs held a length of oiled canvas. A shelf ran the length of the north wall at shoulder height, carrying a tin plate, a tin cup, a small iron skillet with a broken handle, mended by a wire wrap, a stub of tallow candle in a saucer, a rust-spotted tin of matches with a screw lid. In one corner stood a short-handled axe with a chipped edge, a worn helve dark with old sweat. Under the bunk, a wooden box held a coil of picture wire, a bent horseshoe, a tobacco tin of square nails. Everything in the room had been left ready by someone who meant to come back. Someone who had cleaned the firebox, stacked the wood, set the matches where a hand could find them in the dark. Someone who had not come back. Willa shut the door behind her. She dropped the wooden bar into its cleats. She set her bundle on the bunk. She took off her mittens with her teeth, blew on her fingers, the skin white at the tips. The feeling coming back in slow, sharp pulses did not sit down. She laid a fire in the stove. Shavings first pulled from the tin can, set into the firebox in a loose nest. Then pine splits crossed above them, 3 over 2, the way Dorcas had shown her in the first winter, the 9-year-old girl, kneeling beside the old woman on the hearthstone, learning that fire is not built, it is invited. The shavings are the invitation. The splits are the welcome. The logs come later, when the fires has decided to stay. She took a match from the tin, struck it on the stove's iron flank. The head flared with a smell of sulfur that filled the small room like a voice. She held the match to the shavings, until they caught a curl of yellow flame that climbed the first split, found the second, spread. She closed the stove door on the flame, heard the tin stack begin to draw with a low, rising hum, the sound of air being pulled upward through metal, the sound of warmth beginning. Only then did she sit on the edge of the bunk. She put her hands on her knees. She let the shaking come. It came from the legs, First, the deep tremor of muscles that have been working past their reserve. The body's delayed acknowledgement of what it has done. Then the hands. Then the jaw. She sat on the bunk in the dim room, the stove making its small, even noise, her whole body shaking with something that was not cold, not fear, not grief, but all of them pressed into a single vibration that moved through her like a sound she could not hear. The room began to smell of warming iron, warming pine. The cold retreated from the space around the stove first, then from the floor, then from the air at shoulder height. The shaking slowed, stopped. Willa sat still for another minute, listening to the stove, listening to the wind outside, finding the gaps in the chinking, testing them, moving on. Then she got up. She lit the tallow candle off the stove, touching the wick to the iron top, where the heat was strongest, waiting for the tallow to soften, the flame to catch. She carried the candle in its saucer around the perimeter of the floor, walking slowly, eyes on the boards. She was looking for the mouse holes, the drafts, the places where the wood had gone soft. Dorcas had taught her that in any house not lived in, the floor tells the truth first. A roof can look sound from below while the rot works from above. A wall can stand plumb while the chinking fails behind it. But a floor shows everything. The sag where water has pooled, the soft spot where a joist has given way, the gap where the cold comes up from the ground like a hand reaching through. Under the shelf on the north wall, the boards were sound, dry along the west wall by the bunk, sound. But when she came around to the space between the stove, the south wall, the candle flame leaned toward her, a draft. Cold air coming up from below, strong enough to move a flame at knee height. She knelt, held the candle low, felt the cold breath rising between two boards, not through a crack, but through a seam. A deliberate seam, cut clean. She set the candle in its saucer on the floor beside her, worked her fingers along the seam. The boards there were shorter than the others, cut clean at both ends. The nails had been driven into them, not from above, but at an angle from the sides, the heads flush against the neighboring planks. Invisible, unless a person was kneeling with a candle, looking for exactly what Willa was looking for. She looked at them for a long time. The stove ticked behind her. The candle flame steadied in the draft, pointing at her like a finger. Then she rose. She took the short-handled axe from the corner, turned it butt side down, used the flat pole to lever gently at one end of the shorter boards. The nails came up with a small dry protest, a sound she felt through the helve, more than heard, through the air. The sound of iron releasing its grip on wood after decades of holding. The first board lifted, then the second, then the third. She was looking down into a square hole cut in the pine plank floor, edged with a frame of hewn oak, darkened by age to the color of molasses. Below the hole, a set of 5 earthen steps descended into the body of the ridge. At the bottom, a plank door in a plank frame, set into the mountain itself. Willa sat back on her heels. Her hand went to her throat, the tin locket, cold against her skin, the braided horsehair cord rough under her fingertips. She could feel her own pulse in her neck, pressing against the locket with each beat, as though her heart was knocking on a door. She picked up the candle, steadied herself against the oak frame with her free hand, went down the 5 earthen steps, the dirt packed hard, cool under her boots, each step cut square into the ground, with a care that spoke of a person who intended the stairs to last. At the bottom, she stood in front of the door. The door was the same pine as the floor above, gone dark with time, hard as the wood gets when it has spent decades underground, the moisture drawn out of it year by year until what remains is closer to stone than to timber. 2 wrought iron strap hinges, forged by hand, the hammer mark still visible on the flat of the metal. A wooden peg through a hasp, no lock, cut into the top plank of the door, in careful upright letters, made with the point of a knife, 6 words. To whoever finds this, go gently. Willa read them once by the candle. Read them again. The letters were precise, each one carved with the same depth, the same pressure. The hand of someone who understood that these words might be the last ones, read by the next person to stand where Willa was standing, in the light of a candle, at the bottom of 5 steps, with the whole weight of a ridge above them. She drew the peg out of the hasp, set it on the step behind her, lifted the door open on its hinges. The hinges gave a slow, low creak, a sound that had been waiting in the iron for 80 years, patient as rust. released now into the cold underground air, with a voice that was almost human in its weariness. The sound of something that had been closed for a very long time opening. The cellar behind the door was small, perhaps 6 feet square, cut into the rock of the ridge, lined with plank on 3 walls. The air inside was dry, cold, carrying the smell of old wood, old cloth, the faint sweetness of tallow that has been sealed away from light. Willa held the candle up. Along the far wall stood a low pine shelf, 3 items ranged on it, as though set out that morning, placed with the deliberate spacing of someone who wanted the next person to see each one clearly, to understand that each one mattered. A small wooden box of the kind used for tea, bound in tin at the corners. A folded oilskin packet the size of a family Bible. A stoneware jar with a wooden lid, sealed around the rim, with wax the color of old honey. On the floor below the shelf sat a leather saddlebag, cracked at the fold, dark with age. Beside it, a smaller canvas sack tied at the neck with hemp cord. Above the shelf, a single piece of paper was pinned to the plank wall with a square nail. The paper was yellowed, stiff, the edges curled inward, the ink faded to the color of weak tea but still legible. Written in the same upright hand as the words on the door. Willa reached up. She unpinned the paper with her fingernails, careful not to tear it. Feeling the nail resist, then give. She carried the paper up the 5 steps, with the candle held ahead of her, the flame leaning in the draft from the open hatch. She sat cross-legged on the pine floor of the shack beside the stove, the warmth pressing against her right side, the cold from the open hatch pressing against her left. She unfolded the paper on her lap. The paper was headed with a date, the 9th of October, in a year 80 years gone. She read it. She read it again. She read it a 3rd time, slowly, the way a person reads something that is changing the shape of the room around them. A woman named Tabitha Pell Calder had come into this country in a wagon with her husband Josiah Calder, their 2 boys. In the summer of her 24th year, Josiah built this shack with his own hands. They wintered here 3 years, summered in the meadow below. Josiah died of a fall from a horse in the 4th spring. The 2 boys took a fever the following winter. Tabitha lived on alone another 6 years, worked the claim, traded pelts at the settlement, 2 days south. The claim was proved, filed under her name at the land office at Granger's Post. The filing papers were in the oilskin on the shelf. She was leaving tomorrow for her sister's people in the low country because her hands would not hold an axe anymore. She did not wish to die alone in the shack where her husband, her boys had been happy. In the tea box, $92 in gold, silver, saved from 10 years of pelt trade. In the stoneware jar, lard rendered clean. In the saddlebag, Josiah's tools. In the canvas sack, seed. She did not know who would come, or when. She hoped it was someone who needed it. Be gentle with the place. It was loved. Willa sat on the pine floor with the letter across her knee. The stove made its small, even sound. The wind outside came around the eaves, tested the chinking, moved on. The candle flame in its saucer threw her shadow long against the far wall. A girl sitting cross-legged on a floor, a piece of paper in her lap, the shape of her bent head. Tabitha Pell Calder. She said the name aloud. Once. In the empty shack. The name went into the warming air like smoke from a match. Pell. Dorcas Pell, who had taken her in 3 winters, who had taught her to lay a fire that would hold coals through the night, who had taught her to walk in snow without breaking through the crust, who had put a tin locket around her neck, with 2 words folded inside it. Dorcas Pell, from Kentucky people. Tabitha Pell Calder, born in Kentucky, come west in a wagon. Dead in the low country by a south window, under a chestnut tree 80 years ago. Willa put her hand at her throat. Her fingers closed around the tin locket on its braided horsehair cord. She felt the scratched initial D against the pad of her thumb, the shallow groove cut by an awl or a nail, the letter that had rested against her skin every day since she was 14 years old. She understood. Not with evidence, not with proof. With the kind of knowledge that lives below the collarbone, in the place where the body knows what the mind has not yet organized into sentences. The woman who had left this room 80 years ago, for whoever came next. The woman who had taught Dorcas Pell's people. The things that Dorcas Pell had taught Willa, they came from the same ground, the same Kentucky women. The same hands that knew how to hold an axe, render tallow, Red weather off a mountain's shoulder, pack chinking into a seam, so the wind could not find its way through. A thread ran from Tabitha's hands to Dorcas's hands to Willa's hands, through 80 years of silence, through a cellar sealed beneath a pine floor, through a locket on a horsehair cord, through 2 words written on a scrap of paper by a woman with knuckles like walnuts, who had never explained why she chose those particular words. Be steady. Willa closed her fingers around the locket. She held the letter against her chest. She sat in the warming room beside the stove that Josiah Calder had set on 4 flat river stones, in the shack he had built with his own hands, on the floor his wife had swept before she walked down the mountain for the last time. Out the snow was falling. Now she could hear it on the cedar shakes, the soft, continuous sound of the sky, letting go of something it had been holding. Somewhere down below the ridge, Galt, Tiernan, Emmett Shale were making their way back to Sutfield's ranch along Willow Branch, their horses picking through the darkening trail. They believed they had set a girl down to disappear. They believed the snow would cover her tracks by morning, her name by spring. They believed what men of that kind have always believed about women of Willa's kind, that a person without money, without family, without a deed or a horse or a gun, is a person who can be subtracted from the country without the country noticing. They were wrong about all of it, every last piece of it. Wrong about the girl, wrong about the snow, wrong about the ridge. Most of all, wrong about the door beneath the floor, the one that had been waiting 80 years, patient as the iron in its hinges, for a hand that knew what it was reaching for. Willa slept that first night on the plank bunk, the gray wool blanket over the borrowed coat, the stove damped down to a red seam of light along the firebox door. The letter lay on the shelf above her head, next to the candle stub in its saucer. The locket lay against her throat. The hatch in the floor was open. The 3 short boards leaning against the wall, the cold breath from the cellar, mixing with the warm air from the stove, in a slow, invisible current that moved across the room, like a conversation between 2 women who had never met, carried on in a language made of temperature rather than words. In the morning, she would open the door on a hard white world. She would begin to work. The door opened on a hard white world. The ridge above the shack was a single unbroken sheet of snow, running up to the granite where the rock broke through, like the spine of something ancient, lying face down. Below, the fold dropped away into timber. She could not see from the doorstep, pine buried under a weight of white that bent the upper branches into arches. The sky was the color of skimmed milk. No wind. The air so still that Willa could hear the creak of a branch, somewhere below the tree line, the faint tick of snow settling on snow. The silence that comes after a storm has finished its argument with the mountain. She did not stand in the doorway long. Cold is patient. It waits for a person to admire the view. She went back inside, pulled the cellar door wide on its 80-year hinges, carried up the items from the shelf one at a time. The tea box first. She set it on the plank table near the stove, lifted the tin-cornered lid. Gold coins, silver coins, loose, unrolled, laid flat against the wood bottom. She counted them with her forefinger, moving each coin to the opposite side of the box as she counted. $92. She counted again. $92. 10 years of pelt trade weighed out in metal by a woman whose hands had finally refused to hold an axe. Willa closed the lid, slid the box under the bunk against the log wall, where the floor was coldest, where a thief would have to move the bunk to reach it. The stoneware jar came next. She broke the wax seal around the rim with her thumbnail, lifted the wooden lid. Beneath a thumb width of gray, at the surface oxidation, harmless, the lard was pale clean, smelling the way lard is supposed to smell. She scraped the gray away with the back of a spoon she had found on the shelf, tested the white beneath with her finger. Good. A jar of clean rendered lard in December was worth more than money. Money could not be eaten at 4 in the morning, when the stove had gone cold, could not be rubbed into cracked knuckles, could not waterproof a boot seam. The saddlebag held Josiah Calder's tools. She unbuckled the stiff leather, spread the bag open on the bunk. A full-size felling axe with a hickory helve, dark with the sweat of a man dead. 80 years the grain of the wood polished by his grip until it shone like riverstone. A hand adze, its blade curved, nicked but sound. A 2-pound hammer. A wood chisel with a boxwood handle. A small bit with a brace, the chuck still tight. A whetstone, gray-green, the surface dished in the center from years of circular strokes. A coil of tarred hemp twine, a leather awl, a horseshoe rasp, a can of tallow with a wooden lid, a folded oiled rag holding 6 iron files, each one still sharp enough to bite when she drew her thumb across the teeth. The canvas sack held seeds in twists of paper marked in Tabitha's upright hand. Turnip, cabbage, kale, onion, pole bean. A heavier twist, marked simply corn. Willa held each paper twist to the light from the stove, feeling the seeds shift inside like grains of sand. 80 years in a sealed cellar, cold, dry, dark. Whether they would still germinate was a question for spring. For now, she set them back into the canvas sack, tied the neck, placed the sack on the shelf above the bunk where the mice could not reach. For 6 days, she did not leave the ridge. She melted snow in the iron skillet for water, packing the snow tight, setting the skillet on the stove, waiting for the slow melt, pouring the warm water into the tin cup, packing the skillet again. A full cup of water required 3 skillets of snow. She drank 4 cups a day, which meant 12 rounds of melting, which meant she was tending the skillet every hour she was awake. Water was the first job. Water was always the first job. A person could survive 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, 3 hours without shelter in a wind, like the one that came down the ridge on the second night, and did not stop until dawn. She cut the half loaf of bread into 6 portions, ate one each morning with a spoonful of the good lard. She chewed the hard sausage a piece at a time through the day, taking a bite when the hunger sharpened, not before. She ate 2 spoons of lard morning, night, not for the taste, which was the taste of nothing, but for the heat it gave her body, the slow burn of rendered fat that a person feels first in the chest, then in the hands, then behind the eyes. She sharpened the felling axe on the whetstone. Slow circular strokes, the stone wetted with snowmelt, the blade held at the angle Dorcas Pell had shown her at 9 years old, the angle that Dorcas's hands had set by placing them over Willa's hands on the helve, pressing them into the correct position without words, letting the muscles learn what the ears could not be taught. Willa sharpened until the edge would part a hair off her forearm, the way Dorcas had tested every blade she ever put a stone to. In the middle hours, when the sun stood highest over the fold, she went out with the axe. Standing dead pine grew, in clusters, along the north side of the fold, above the shack trees that had died on their feet, shed their bark. Gone silver gray, their wood dried by years of wind into a hardness that rang when the axe struck it. She felled them one at a time, working close to the base, cutting a notch on the downhill side first, then a back cut from above, letting the tree fall into the fold where she could reach it. She limbed each trunk where it fell, cut the limbs into stove lengths, bundled the lengths with loops of tarred twine, dragged them back to the shack, one bundle at a time. Splitting came in the evening, by lamplight the candle stub, then a second stub she found in the saddlebag, wrapped in the oiled rag. She stood the stove lengths on the hearthstone, drove the axe through them, with short, controlled swings. The wood split clean along the grain with a sound like a book opening. She pulled the fallen, chinking from the north wall seams, with her fingers, working from inside, where the gaps showed as stripes of white light. She heated water on the stove, mixed the dry clay with pine needles, a fingertip of lard for binding, worked the paste into the seams from the top course down. She pressed each seam with her thumb until the paste seated against the logs on both sides, until the stripe of light disappeared, until the wall became a wall again instead of a sieve. She cut fresh cedar shakes from a windfall in the fold, a tree that had come down years ago, its trunk half buried in duff, the heartwood still red, still sound. She split the shakes along the grain with the hand adze, working each one to a taper so that water running down the roof face would carry past the overlap rather than seeping under. By the 8th day, she had laid a patch 4 feet across over the worst of the ridge sag, nailed it home with square nails from the tobacco tin under the bunk. The hammer blows, flat, sharp in the cold air. Each night she slept deeper. Each morning, she woke with less stiffness in the legs, less ache in the hands. The body was recalibrating itself around the work, the way a clock recalibrates around a new mainspring, the rhythm changing, the mechanism adjusting, the hands finding their new positions. On the 10th day, the wind swung south. The crust softened in the sun. Water began to move under the snow in thin, dark lanes that appeared at mid-morning, disappeared by afternoon. Willa stood in the doorway of the shack, watching the softening, reading it the way Dorcas had taught her to read a mountain in transition, not for what it was doing, but for what it was about to do. The trail would open before the passes did. The wagon road to Granger's Post would be passable within a day. She had work to do there. She packed the oilskin packet of filing papers. $40 of Tabitha's coin, her own $4.80, the written character from Corinne Sutfield, still in its folded envelope. A wedge of good lard wrapped in oilcloth for the road. She barred the shack door from outside with a plank wedged under the latch, shouldered her pack, walked south along the ridge on the path. Tabitha Pell Calder had walked 80 years before, the same rock underfoot, the same timber below, the same sky above, a different woman carrying a different weight toward the same settlement. She slept one night in a stand of fir with a small fire behind a rock. She fed the fire through the dark hours with dead branches broken to arm length, waking every time the heat on her face dropped below the threshold. Her body had learned to recognize as the difference between sleeping freezing. By dawn, the fire was ash. She kicked snow over it, shouldered her pack, walked on. On the afternoon of the second day, she came down out of the pines into a wagon track. Ruts frozen hard, the marks of iron-rimmed wheels pressed into mud that had turned to stone. She followed the track east for 2 hours. Granger's Post appeared around a bend in the creek, a scatter of buildings along both sides of the wagon road, a livery with a split-rail corral, a mercantile with a false front, a feed store with rooms above it, a low building with a tin roof marked by a painted board. Land office. The land office was a single room, with a plank counter running its width, a coal stove in the corner, glowing through its seams, shelves of ledgers along the back wall, each ledger bound in leather, each spine marked with a year. Behind the counter sat a man named Josias Haverhill, 58 years old. Thin through the shoulders, slow-moving, the deliberate slowness of a man who had learned that haste in a land office causes errors that take years to undo. Wire spectacles low on his nose, ink stains on the first 2 fingers of his right hand, so old they had become permanent. Willa set the oilskin packet on the counter. She opened it. She laid the papers flat, the filing, the proof of claim, the surveyor's description, the dated entry in the records of the land office at Granger's Post, signed by a clerk whose name Willa could not read because the ink had gone to brown. Josias Haverhill adjusted his spectacles. He read the filing papers through once, his lips moving slightly. He read them again without the lips moving. He went to the shelf, took down a leather-bound ledger marked with the year. Tabitha had written her letter, brought it to the counter, opened it to a page marked with a ribbon. He turned pages for a quarter of an hour without speaking. The coal stove ticked. A fly that had survived the winter on the warmth of the stove walked the length of the counter between them. When Josias looked up, his face held the expression of a man who has found something he expected to find but hoped he would not have to explain. The claim had been filed, proved, never abandoned on the books. No tax had been laid on unpatented ground in that valley. The territorial statute exempted claims, proved before the survey grid, reached the upper valleys, which it still had not. If Willa could show relation to the filer, or an instrument of conveyance, the ground would carry to her under territorial inheritance provisions. The process would want a witness from the family line, a magistrate's seal, 6 weeks if she was patient. I am patient. Josias Haverhill almost smiled. The corners of his mouth moved a fraction of an inch, stopped, returned. He gave her a receipt for the papers, wrote it out in a hand so even it looked printed, stamped it with the office seal. He placed the filing papers in a drawer, locked the drawer, set the key on a hook behind the ledger shelf. Then he paused. He removed his spectacles, held them by one earpiece, looked at Willa with the particular directness of a man about to say something he was not required to say. Miss Garrett, I will tell you a thing, because it is my habit to tell people the shape of the ground they are walking on. His voice carried the careful weight of a man who measured sentences, the way he measured property lines, once accurately, without waste. There is a man who has been inquiring at this office about old claims in the upper valleys, proved claims with no current occupant. His name is Cresswell Nye. He arrived from east of the divide in September. He has an interest in ground, the way some men have an interest in horses, not to ride, but to own. Willa felt something shift in the floor beneath her feet, a sensation that was not physical. The room looked the same, the counter, the stove, the ledgers, but the air had changed. Has he asked about this claim? Not yet. He has asked about 3 others in the same valley. Yours sits between 2 of them. Willa folded the receipt into her coat pocket. She thanked Josias Haverill with a nod that carried the weight a handshake would have carried between 2 men. Walked out of the land office into a street that looked different than it had looked when she walked in, not because the street had changed, but because Willa now understood that the ground beneath the shack was worth something to someone other than her. She took a room that night above the feed store. 15 cents, paid from her own $4.80. The woman who kept the rooms was Beulah Crane, 44, widowed 6 years, the kind of thin that comes from feeding other people before feeding yourself. Her hair pulled back so tight, it tugged the skin at her temples into lines that might have been severity, or might have been exhaustion, or might have been both pressed into the same face over so many years that the face no longer knew the difference. Beulah gave her a room without comment, a narrow space under the eaves, with a rope bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the freight scales in the yard below. Then she set a bowl of bean soup in front of Willa, at the table in the back kitchen, a slice of raw onion on top, a spoon beside it. She sat down across the table. She did not eat. She watched Willa eat. After a full minute of watching, she spoke. "You come down off the ridge alone?" It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "No horse, no ma'am. No family waiting down here for you?" "No." Beulah Crane's eyes moved over Willa's face. The way a person reads a document, they are not sure they trust, looking for the watermark, the misaligned type, the signature that does not match. She did not find what she was looking for, which seemed to satisfy her more than finding it would have. Room is 15 cents a night. Payment before you sleep. Soup is on the house tonight because you look like you need it. Tomorrow the soup is 5 cents. She stood up, took her own cup to the washstand, left the kitchen without another word. Trust was not a thing Beulah Crane gave away. It was a thing she placed on a shelf, high up, out of easy reach, where a person had to demonstrate they were tall enough to deserve it. In the morning, Willa went to the mercantile. The building sat at the center of Granger's Post, the way a mercantile sits, the center of every settlement in the territory, the place where money changes hands, where information changes mouths, where a person's name gets attached to the shape of their purchasing. Buy flour, coffee, salt. You are feeding a household. Buy nails, a hatchet head, set, tarred cord. You are building something. Buy both in the same visit. You are a person who intends to stay. The mercantile keeper was Silas Fenton, 61 years old. A man built like a rain barrel, round through the middle, solid through the legs, arms that looked short until he reached for the top shelf without stretching. He had kept this store for 23 years. Knew every rancher, freighter, hired hand within 40 miles of the post by name, by credit, by the sound of their boots on his porch. He had known Dorcas Pell. He had sold her soap wrapping paper on market Saturdays. For years, brown pay sheet 2 cents each. Willa set her list on the counter. Flour, cornmeal, salt, coffee, dried apples, a paper of tea, a bar of yellow soap, a bolt of unbleached muslin, 2 spools of thread, a package of needles, a hatchet head to replace the chipped one on the short axe at the shack, a small crock, 8 hen's eggs packed in bran in a tin pail with a wire handle. Silas Fenton read the list. He looked at Willa over the top of it. That is a list for a woman setting up a household. You do not look like a woman who has a household to set up, Willa told him. Not everything, not the cellar, not the coin, not the letter. She told him about the claim, the filing papers, the land office. She told him whose people she was tracing. She said Dorcas Pell's name. Silas Fenton set the list down on the counter. His face changed, not softened, not warmed, but shifted in the way a landscape shifts when a cloud moves off the sun. Something that had been in shadow came into light. Dorcas Pell. He repeated the name, the way a man repeats, a name he has not spoken in years but has not forgotten. She died when 7 years ago. 8? 7, I was 15. She bought brown paper from me every market Saturday. Never haggled. Never bought on credit. paid in coin, exact change every time. He paused. She made soap from tallow, wood ash. Her chinking mix, I sold her the pine needle bales for it. What did she use for the binding agent? Willa met his eyes. She understood what he was doing. He was not making conversation. He was testing her. A person who claims a connection to the dead must prove it with knowledge the dead would have shared. Lard. A fingertip per handful of clay. More than that turns the mix greasy, takes twice as long to set. Silas Fenton held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he reached under the counter, brought up a wire basket of eggs, began packing them into the tin pail, with bran from a sack at his feet. These at cost 16 cents the dozen. I will give you 8 for 9 cents. He added a length of tarred cord to the pile on the counter, without being asked, without adding it to the bill. It was not charity. It was the cord a man gives to a woman whose teacher bought brown paper from him every Saturday for years without ever, once, needing to be told the price. Willa loaded her purchases into a canvas grain sack, shouldered it, started back up the wagon track before noon. She was 2 hours out of Granger's Post. The settlement already lost, behind the first bend of the creek, the timber closing in on both sides of the track, when a freighter pulled up alongside her. The freighter was Virgil Dunmore, 37 years old. A man who drove a 2-mule wagon between the settlements twice a month, the way a river runs between its banks, steady, predictable, arriving when expected. He had heard in town that morning about the girl with the 80-year papers. News in a settlement the size of Granger's Post moves the way. Smoke moves rising from the source, spreading outward, reaching every corner of the room before the fire is out. He took her as far as the fork, where the wagon track split north, to the upper valleys, south toward the rail towns. He would not accept a coin for the ride. He would accept a promise. If she meant to keep the shack, he would carry a load of milled boards up in the spring, for the price of the trip. $1.50. Half up front. Willa reached into her coat. She counted out 75 cents from the cotton pouch pinned inside her petticoat. She held the coins out across the wagon seat. Virgil Dunmore took them, dropped them into his vest pocket, without counting, nodded once, drove on. Back at the ridge, the shack was as she had left it, bar across the door, stove cold, the room holding the faint smell of chinking clay, wood smoke. She lit the stove, set the eggs into a straw nest, in the wooden box under the bunk, hung the muslin from the pegs above the bed. The room was becoming hers. Not through ownership that would come later, if it came at all, but through the particular intimacy that happens when a person's hands have touched every surface in a room, when the marks on the wood are her marks, when the smell of the place is the smell of her soap, her coffee, her fire. She began the second round of work. She cut a north window into the log wall, at shoulder height, with the bit brace, wood chisel. The work took a full day, scoring the logs from inside, cutting through from outside with the felling axe, squaring the opening with the chisel until these sat true. She framed the window with hewn pine, mortised at the corners, fitted tight. She glazed it with oiled paper stretched on a light frame, not glass, not yet, but enough to let light in while keeping wind out. Enough to let her see the ridge from inside the shack, which mattered more than she could have explained to anyone who had not spent a winter in a room without windows. She built a lean-to on the east end for a woodshed, unmilled poles cut from the fold above, peeled of bark, so they would not rot in the first season, set into the ground with tamped earth around the bases. Cedar shakes for the roof, the same split she had used on the main cabin, laid with the taper facing down, a stone path between the shack door, the spring seep 30 yards down the fold-flat stones carried, one at a time, from the creek bed below the tree line, set into the mud, tamped level with the back of the axe head. The weeks turned. December became January. January became the long, locked mouth of February, the month that does not speak, that holds the cold between its teeth. Like a man holding a nail, he has not yet decided where to drive. Willa fell into a rhythm stove. Water, wood, food, work, stove, again. The rhythm was not monotony. The rhythm was survival, dressed in repetition. Each day the same shape, but not the same weight. Each morning carrying forward what the evening before had built. She came down to Granger's Post twice in those months. Each time she packed her goods on her back, walked the 2-day trail, spent a night in Beulah Crane's room, above the feed store. Each time Beulah charged her 15 cents for the room, 5 cents for the soup. Each time Beulah asked her nothing, offered nothing, except the clean sheets on the rope bed, the hot soup on the table. Each time Willa paid in coin, exact change, the way Dorcas Pell had paid Silas Fenton for brown paper on market Saturdays. On the second visit, in the last week of January, Willa brought down a small paper-wrapped bar of yellow soap she had made at the shack from the good lard, wood ash from the stove. She set it on the table in Beulah's kitchen after supper, next to the empty soup bowl. Beulah picked it up, turned it over in her fingers, held it to her nose. "You made this, from lard I rendered myself, ash from pine." Beulah set the soap down on the table. She looked at Willa for a long time, the look of a woman who is revising an estimate she made too quickly. Then she stood, went to the shelf above the washstand, brought back a clean cotton towel folded into a square. "You can leave your pack here between trips, the shelf behind the door. I will not charge for storage." It was the first thing Beulah Crane had offered Willa that was not a transaction. It was the first crack in the wall, not a door, not yet, but a place where light came through. In April, the snow pulled back from the meadow below the shack, like a blanket drawn down by slow hands. The ground beneath was dark, wet, the smell of it rising into the warming air, the smell of dirt that has been under pressure for 5 months, releasing everything it held. Willa walked the meadow from end to end, testing the soil with a stick pushed into the earth to the depth of her forearm. Dark soil, rich, the kind of ground that has been waiting. Virgil Dunmore came up the wagon track on the second Saturday of April, with a load of milled boards stacked in the bed of his 2-mule wagon. Riding beside him on the bench seat was a man named Theron Birch. Theron Birch was 29 years old, a joiner by trade, a man who worked wood with the precision of someone who understood that a joint cut wrong by a 1/16 of an inch would fail in a year, while a joint cut right would hold until the wood itself gave out. His left hand was damaged from saw the 2 smallest fingers gone at the second knuckle, the remaining 3 stiff in the morning, loosening through the day as the work warmed them. He carried his own tools in a canvas roll tied with hemp cord, each chisel, each gouge, each plain iron nested in its own pocket. He was quiet. He worked without speaking. He measured twice, cut once, set each board with a level he carried in his back pocket, a small brass instrument with a bubble in a glass tube, that Willa watched with the fascination of a person seeing a tool she had never seen before, do a thing she had always done by eye. He stayed 2 days. He helped Willa hang a proper plank door with iron hinges. He had forged himself the hinge plates thick, the pins straight, the knuckles tight enough that the door swung without sag. He reframed the south window with milled boards, planed the sill flat, fitted a pine sash that would take a proper pane of glass when one could be gotten up the ridge. Willa offered payment in coin. Theron Birch shook his head. "A jar of that lard. 2 dozen eggs if the hen has started laying." He paused. He looked at the shack, the patched roof, the chinked walls, the new door, the stone path running down to the spring. He looked at it, the way a craftsman looks at work done by hands that have been taught well but have not yet had the years to develop the confidence that separates competence from mastery. "You have done good work here. The chinking will hold if you repack it in the fall before the frost locks the clay. The roof patch needs another course of shakes on the downhill side. The water will pool at the seam if you leave it." He climbed onto the wagon seat beside Virgil. Before Virgil clicked the mules forward, Theron turned back. "I will tell you something because Virgil asked me to come up here when I did not want to. There is a man named Nye buying up old claims in these valleys. I did not want to be seen helping on a claim that might end up in dispute." Virgil said the claim was sound. "I believe him, but you should know that not everyone in Granger's Post believes the same." The wagon moved down the track. Willa stood in the doorway of the shack, the new door behind her on its new hinges, Theron's words settling into the space between what she had built, what might be taken from her. She bought a milk goat from a family at the crossing, below the ridge, $4 from Tabitha's coin. The goat was brown with white ears, calm-eyed, patient, the kind of animal that has decided the world is acceptable. Willa named her Bess. Bess came up the ridge on a lead behind Willa, without balking once, as though she had been waiting for someone to show her where the grass was. Willa built a small pole barn against the west side of the shack, forked hay into a manger, watched Bess settle into the stall, the way a person settles into a chair in a house they have been invited to. In the meadow, Willa broke ground with a borrowed single blade, plow hooked to Virgil Dunmore's near mule. The mule worked without complaint, leaning into the harness with the steady pull of an animal that understands its job. Willa planted Tabitha's corn in 6 long rows along the south fence line, the turnip, cabbage, kale in a squared kitchen plot behind the barn. The pole beans up hazel poles cut from the fold. The corn came up in the 3rd week, pale green shoots, pushing through the dark soil in lines so straight they looked drawn. Willa stood at the edge of the plot at dawn, looking at them. 80 years in a sealed cellar, cold, dry, dark. The seeds had waited. The seeds had kept. The thing Tabitha had saved, for whoever came next had pushed through the dirt into the light alive. The claim should have gone through by the end of May. Josias Haverill had said 6 weeks. 6 weeks had passed. Then 7. On her 3rd Saturday trip to Granger's Post, a warm morning in late May, the trail dry enough that she made the walk in a day instead of 2, Willa went to the land office before the mercantile. Josias was behind the counter. He did not look up when she came in. He was reading a document laid flat on the counter, his spectacles pushed up onto his forehead. Reading without them, which meant the document was new enough that the ink was dark. He finished reading. He folded the document. He put his spectacles back on. Then he looked at Willa. "Miss Garrett, there has been a complication." The word fell into the room like a stone into a well. Willa heard it drop. She waited for it to hit bottom. A claim dispute has been filed against the Calder patent. Filed 3 days ago by a man named Cresswell Nye. He asserts the claim was abandoned when Tabitha Pell Calder left the ridge 80 years ago, that no occupancy or improvement was maintained, that the filing lapsed under territorial statute. He has submitted a lien instrument purporting to show an unpaid debt of Josiah Calder's secured against the ground. Josias laid the folded document on the counter between them. His fingers rested on it, the ink-stained tips dark against the pale paper. "I have examined the lien. It was filed in a jurisdiction east of the divide. I cannot speak to its validity without a magistrate's ruling. A territorial circuit judge, or in Polk, is expected in Granger's Post within 5 weeks. The dispute will be heard then. 5 weeks. 5 weeks. In the meantime, the patent process is held. I cannot issue the claim to you while a dispute is pending." Willa looked at the folded document on the counter. She did not pick it up. She did not need to read it to understand what it meant. Someone with money, with lawyers, with documents filed in jurisdictions she had never heard of, was reaching for the ground beneath her feet. The same ground Tabitha Pell Calder had proved with 6 years of labor. The same ground Willa had been repairing, planting, building on since December. The man Nye. Is he here? He was in town yesterday. He has taken a room at the hotel. Josias paused. He removed his spectacles again. The gesture that meant he was about to say something, the office did not require him to say. He was not alone. He had a man with him. I did not catch the man's name, but I have seen him before. He came through here in January, with a letter for the freight station. The letter was from a ranch on Willow Branch. Willa's hand went to the counter. She pressed her palm flat against the wood, the way a person presses a hand against a wall, when the floor shifts beneath them. Willow Branch, the Sutfield Ranch. I know the seal. The room did not move. The stove did not stop ticking. The fly on the counter did not change its course. But the shape of the world, the shape Willa had been building in her head since December, the shape in which she had been abandoned by an employer who needed to reduce his household, left on a ridge by 2 hired hands following orders, found by chance, a shack that happened to hold a cellar, that shape broke apart. The pieces rearranged themselves into something colder, something with edges. Harlan Sutfield had not reduced his household. He had removed her. The distinction was the difference between weather, which passes, and act, which is aimed. She left the land office. She walked down the plank sidewalk toward the mercantile, her boots loud on the boards, the sound of her own walking the only sound she could hear. Ahead of her, 2 men were coming out of the hotel, a 2-story building, with a painted porch that sat at the north end of the street. The first was a man she had never seen, 50 or past it. Trimmed beard, the cut of it precise. A good wool coat, dark, well brushed, the coat of a man who keeps his appearance, the way a merchant keeps his ledger, as evidence of solvency. He carried himself with the settled weight of a person accustomed to walking into rooms where the chairs are already arranged in his favor. Beside him walked a shorter man, younger, slope-shouldered, with the look of someone employed to stand near a door. Willa did not know his face. She did not need to. She knew the type. Every ranch along Willow Branch had one. The man who rides where he is told, delivers what he is given, does not ask what the envelope contains. The two men turned up the sidewalk toward the land office. The older one, Nye, it had to be Nye, passed within 3 feet of Willa. He did not look at her. He did not know her face. She was a girl in a worn coat on a plank sidewalk in a settlement at the edge of the territory. The kind of person a man like Cresswell Nye looked through the way a person looks through a window that has nothing behind it. He spoke to the man beside him as they walked. A sentence, short, delivered in the voice of a man confirming a fact he already knew, the way a person checks a figure in a column of numbers before turning the page. Sutfield was right. Nobody up there. Willa heard it, every word. The syllables entered her ears with the clarity of a hammer striking a nail, the clear, flat ring of metal on metal. She kept walking. She did not stop. She did not turn. She went into the mercantile, bought what she needed from Silas Fenton, packed her goods, left Granger's Post by the south track before noon. She walked the first mile without thinking. The second mile she thought. The third mile she understood. Harlan Sutfield knew about the claim. He had always known. He had found the old filing in the land office. Records a rancher who buys ground on Willow Branch, checks the survey maps, checks the ledgers, sees what lies above him on the ridge, the way a man standing at the base of a mountain looks up to see what is at the top. He had seen Tabitha Pell Calder's proved claim. He had seen the 160 acres of timber, meadow, creek. He had not known about the cellar, the coin, the letter. He had wanted the ground. The ground was worth more than a kitchen girl's wages, more than the $6.60 he had taken from her tobacco tin, more than the cost of 2 hired hands, riding a day and a half to set her on a ridge. He had removed Willa from his household, not because he needed to cut expenses, but because he needed her gone, before Nye filed on the claim. A girl with no family, no money, no horse, a girl who would disappear into the first winter storm, whose name would fade from the settlement records, the way chalk fades from a board, rubbed out by weather time, indifference. He had not counted on Dorcas Pell. He had not counted on a woman dead 7 years, whose teaching had walked Willa off a ridge, into a shack, down 5 earthen steps, into an inheritance he did not know existed. He had aimed at a fence post. He had hit a person. The person was still standing. Willa climbed the ridge in the late afternoon light, the pack heavy on her shoulders, the trail dry underfoot. She came around the last bend, saw the shack in its fold, the new door, the patched roof, the lean-to woodshed, the stone path running down to the spring, the pole barn where Bess stood in the late sun, chewing her cud with the calm patience of an animal who has never been lied to. She set the pack down inside the door. She sat on the bunk. She took the tin locket in her fingers, turned it, felt the scratch D against her thumb. She thought about the 5 weeks ahead. A circuit judge. A courtroom that would be a counter in a land office. Cresswell Nye with his good coat, his documents, his man who stood near doors. Harlan Sutfield behind him, invisible, paying. She needed Parmelia Pell Stokes, 72 years old, living in the low country, the daughter of Tabitha's youngest sister, the blood witness, who could seal the chain from Tabitha to Dorcas, to Willa. Without Parmelia, the connection between Willa Garrett, the Pell name was Willa's word against Nye's paper. A word is breath. Paper is weight. In a land office before a circuit judge, weight wins. She would write to Josias in the morning, ask him to send word to Parmelia by the fastest route rail, then wagon, then whatever came after. 5 weeks. A letter could reach the low country in 10 days. Parmelia could travel back in 12. If the letter arrived, if Parmelia was willing, if the road held, if the weather cooperated, if the old woman's body could take the journey, if each one aboard in a bridge she was building across a gap she could not see the bottom of. 5 weeks to prove she belonged on the ground. Tabitha Pell Calder had proved with her hands 80 years before. 5 weeks to hold what she had built against a man who bought, Claims the way other men bought horses, not to keep but to sell. 5 weeks to answer the question that Harlan Sutfield had asked when he took $6.60 from a tobacco tin behind a flour bin in his own kitchen. What happens when you subtract a person from the country? The answer was sitting on a plank bunk on Sparrow Ridge with a tin locket at her throat, a ledger in her head of every nail driven, every shake laid, every row of corn pushing through the dark soil of a meadow that had been waiting 80 years for someone to plant it. A woman who has been erased does not disappear. She builds the proof of her own existence with her hands, one board at a time, until the proof is a house. The house is a claim. The claim is a name written in a ledger that cannot be rubbed out. Willa Garrett closed her hand around the locket. She looked at the seam in the floor where the 3 short boards lay over Tabitha's cellar, the boards she had never nailed shut, the opening she had sanded, waxed, fitted flush, ready to be lifted by a fingernail. Below them, the 5 earthen steps went down to the old plank door with its carved words. Go gently. She intended to go gently. She also intended to go nowhere. The letter went out the next morning. Willa wrote it at the plank table by the north window, using a pencil stub Josias Haverhill had given her on her last visit. Pressing the words into a sheet of brown wrapping paper, Silas Fenton had slipped into her pack without charging for it. She wrote in the upright hand she had been schooling her letters into, since the winter, the hand that looked, if a person held it at arm's length, like a hand that had been taught by someone whose hand had been taught, by someone whose hand had come out of Kentucky, in a wagon 80 years before. She addressed the letter to Parmelia Pell Stokes, care of the postmaster at Laurel Station, in the Low Country. The address Josias had found in a territorial directory, kept on the shelf behind his ledgers. She folded the brown paper into thirds, sealed it with a drop of tallow from the candle stub, carried it down the ridge to Granger's Post in a single day's walk, placed it in Josias Haverhill's hand at the land office counter before noon. Josias read the address. He set the letter in the outgoing mail sack behind the counter, a canvas bag that went down to the rail depot twice a week, on Virgil Dunmore's freight wagon. He calculated without being asked, 10 days to Laurel Station if the rail runs on schedule, 2 days for the postmaster to locate her, 12 days for the return journey by rail, then wagon from the junction. If she is willing, if she is able. That is 24 days. 24 days. The hearing is set for the second Tuesday of June. That is 31 days from today. 7 days of margin. Willa did the arithmetic standing at the counter. 7 days for a letter to arrive, for an old woman to read it, decide, pack, travel. 7 days for everything that could go wrong between Laurel Station, Granger's Post, a rail delay, a washed-out bridge, a day of fever, a missed connection. 7 days, that might be enough or might be nothing. She walked back up the ridge that afternoon, carrying the arithmetic in her chest, the way a person carries a stone they cannot set down. The trail was dry, the June heat building in the valley below, the air smelling of pine pitch, warm rock, the first wildflowers, pushing through the cleared ground at the edge of the timber. She did not notice them. She was counting days the way she had counted breaths on the ridge in December. In fours, because fours were manageable, because a person who counts in fours can survive anything that fits inside the count. The 5 weeks that followed were the hardest work Willa had done since the first 6 days in the shack. Not because the work itself was harder. The ground was thawed, the tools were sharp, the days were long with light, because the work now carried a second weight. Every nail she drove, every row she planted, every improvement she made to the claim was evidence. Not evidence for herself. Evidence for a judge she had never met, who would sit behind a plank counter in a land office 5 weeks from now to decide whether the ground beneath her feet belonged to her or to a man in a good wool coat who had never set a boot on it. She worked the meadow from first light until the sun dropped behind the western ridge. She finished the corn rows, 6 long lines, running south to north along the fence, the stalks already knee-high, the leaves broad enough to throw shadows on the dark soil between them. She weeded the kitchen plot by hand, pulling each weed at the root, shaking the dirt from it, laying it on the edge of the plot to dry. She harvested the first turnips in the 3rd week, small, white, firm, the flesh sweet with the sweetness that comes from cold nights, following warm days. She carried 3 of them down to Granger's Post on her next trip, set them on Silas Fenton's counter, without explanation. Silas picked one up, turned it in his thick fingers, held it to the light. Elk Ridge turnip. Sparrow Ridge. Same ground. Different name. He set the turnip down. This grew from the old seed? 80 years in a cellar. Silas Fenton looked at the turnip on his counter, the way a man looks at something that has no right to exist but does. Then he opened the ledger he kept under the counter, the one with the columns for local trade, the one where names were written beside what they brought in. What they took out wrote GAR-IT in the left column, Turn IP, 3 in the right. It was the first time Willa's name appeared in a Granger's Post ledger for something she had produced, rather than something she had purchased. She rebuilt the pole barn's south wall, where the posts had shifted with the spring thaw, resetting them deeper, tamping the earth harder, bracing them with cross poles notched at the joints. She extended the stone path from the spring seep to the kitchen plot, 40 yards of flat stones carried from the creek bed, set by hand, leveled with the back of the axe. She split a cord of wood for the coming winter, stacked it in the lean-to woodshed, with the bark side up so the rain would run off. The way Dorcas had taught her, wood stacked bark down rots from the inside. Bark up sheds water like a roof. In Granger's Post, the ground was shifting, in ways Willa could feel but not see. Cresswell Nye had taken a room at the hotel for the duration. He ate his meals in the dining room. He walked the plank sidewalks in his good coat, with the man called Farley at his shoulder. He spoke to people, the livery keeper, the postmaster, the woman who ran the laundry, the men who drank at the saloon on Saturday evenings. He did not raise his voice. He did not make threats. He made observations. He observed that old claims tied up in probate were bad for the valley. He observed that capital brought progress, that progress brought the railroad spur the settlement had been promised for 3 years. He observed that a girl living alone on a ridge, with no family, no husband, no clear title was a situation the territory's laws were designed to resolve. He was careful. He was patient. He had the patience of money, which is the patience of a man who knows that the clock is on his side because he can afford to wind it. The settlement began to divide, not openly, not with declarations, but with the small gestures that precede declarations, the way tremors precede a quake. The postmaster, who had always nodded to Willa when she came for mail, began nodding without meeting her eyes. The woman at the laundry, who had washed Willa's muslin shift twice for a nickel, raised the price to 8 cents without explanation. The livery keeper, who had let Willa water at the trough on her way through town, put a chain on the gate. None of them spoke against her. None of them spoke for her. They were reading the wind, the way people in small settlements have always read the wind, not to see where it was blowing, but to see where it might blow next, so they could arrange themselves accordingly. Silas Fenton held his ground. He sold to Willa at the same prices he had always sold to her. He did not discuss the claim dispute in his store. He did not discuss Nye. When a man at the counter one Saturday asked Silas what he thought about the Ridge girl's chances, Silas measured out a pound of coffee beans, wrote the figure in his ledger, looked up. I think this is a mercantile. I sell goods. I do not sell opinions. Bola Crane held her ground by holding it the way. Bola held everything close to the chest, without announcement. Willa's pack stayed on the shelf behind the door. The room stayed 15 cents. The soup stayed 5. On the evening before Willa's last trip, back up the ridge before the hearing, Beulah set a second bowl of soup on the table, without being asked. Sat down across from Willa, ate with her. They did not speak. The shared meal said what neither of them would have known how to say with words that trust, once placed on the high shelf, stays there, unless the person who placed it takes it down. Theron Birch was absent. He had not come up the ridge since April. Virgil Dunmore told Willa, on a freight run in the 3rd week of May, that Theron had taken a joinery contract at the rail depot 2 days south. Whether the contract was real, or whether Theron had put distance between himself, the dispute was something Virgil did not say. What he did say, standing beside his mule wagon at the fork where the track split, his hat pushed back on his forehead, was this: Theron is a man who works with his hands. Men who work with their hands do not fight well against men who work with paper. He is not a coward. He is a carpenter. Willa understood. She did not blame Theron. A man with a damaged hand, who makes his living with the hand that remains, cannot afford to put that hand into a fight that might cost him the contracts that keep him fed. Fear, practicality in a man's life on the edge of the territory, the line between them was often too thin to see. On a night in the 4th week, a warm night, the air soft, with the smell of the meadow grass coming into its full growth, the corn knee-high, the beans climbing their hazel poles, Willa woke to a sound she could not place. She lay still on the bunk. The stove was cold. She had not lit it for a week. The nights warm enough now to sleep under the wool blanket without heat. The room was dark. Through the oiled paper of the north window, a faint gray light moon behind cloud, the light flat, without shadow. The sound came again, a thump dull, not close, from the east side of the shack, from the woodshed. She swung her legs off the bunk. Her feet found the pine floor. She stood, crossed to the door, lifted the bar from its cleats. She opened the door a crack, the new door on Theron's hinges, moving without sound. The night air came in warm, carrying a smell that did not belong. Smoke. Not wood smoke from a stove, not campfire, smoke carried on the wind from a traveler's camp below the ridge. This was fresh smoke, the sharp, acrid smell of green wood catching flame, of sap boiling in pine, of something that has been lit rather than built. She pushed the door wide. To her left, the lean-to woodshed was burning. The fire had started at the base of the north wall. She could see the origin point, a low orange glow creeping up the unmilled poles. The flame, finding the dry cedar shakes of the roof, climbing with the quick hunger of fire that has been fed something to start it. Kerosene. She could smell it under the smoke, the petroleum sweetness cutting through the wood smoke like a blade through cloth. She did not think, she moved. She grabbed the tin pail from beside the door, the same pail she carried water from the spring. And every morning ran down the stone path to the seep, filled the pail, ran back, threw the water at the base of the flames. Steam rose. The fire pulled back for a moment, then found fresh wood, climbed again. She ran to the spring a second time, a third, a fourth. Each trip took 40 seconds. Each 40 seconds, the fire gained what the water had taken. On the 5th trip, coming back up the stone path, with the pail sloshing against her legs, she heard Bess. The goat was crying in the pole barn, on the west side of the shack, the high, thin bleat of an animal that smells smoke, feels heat, cannot get out. Willa stopped. The woodshed was on the east side. The pole barn was on the west. The shack stood between them. If the fire jumped the shack roof, if the cedar shakes she had laid herself, caught the way cedar catches, fast, hot, total, the pole barn would go next. She set the pail down. She ran to the pole barn. The gate was open. The gate was open because she had not latched it. She had come in from the meadow at dusk, led Bess into the stall, forked hay into the manger, walked back to the shack for supper. She had not dropped the pin into the gate latch. She had not done it because her hands were full of the hay fork, because her mind was on the hearing, 12 days away, because a person who is carrying a weight in her chest does not always remember to close the gate behind her. Bess had pushed the gate open sometime in the night. The goat was not in the stall. The goat was somewhere outside in the meadow, on the slope, in the fold above the shack where the dead pines stood. Willa had come out of the shack to find Bess, had opened the shack door, had left the shack door open with the lamp still burning on the table inside. The yellow square of light falling through the doorway onto the stone path, like a signal fire visible from the trail, visible from the fold above, visible to anyone standing in the dark with a bottle of kerosene, watching. Farley. It had to be Farley, the slope-shouldered man who stood near doors, who carried letters between Sutfield's ranch on Willow Branch to wherever Nye needed them carried. Willa had not seen him. She had not heard a horse. She would not find proof, no boot prints she could match, no dropped item, nothing a judge would accept. Just the smell of kerosene on scorched wood, the knowledge that fires do not start themselves at the base of a wall on a windless night. She found Bess in the fold above the shack, standing in a patch of moonlight between two granite outcrops, chewing a mouthful of wild grass, with the serene indifference of an animal that does not understand what it has cost. Willa led her back to the pole barn, latched the gate, the pin dropping into the slot, with a small iron sound that she felt in her teeth, then went back to the woodshed. The fire had burned through the north wall, consumed the roof shakes, eaten a third of the stacked cordwood. The rest she saved, pulling the unburned wood out of the structure with her bare hands, dragging it into the open ground, south of the shack, where sparks could not reach it. By the time the fire burned itself down to coals, the sky in the east was going from black to gray. Her hands were blistered across both palms. Her wool nightshift was scorched at the hem. The woodshed was gone. The poles blackened, the roof fallen in, the stone foundation still standing but holding nothing. She sat on the ground beside the smoking ruin. The dawn light came up over the ridge, touching the shack, the pole barn, the meadow below, the corn rows standing in their straight lines. Everything she had built was still here. Everything except the woodshed. 3 weeks of work. Unmilled poles she had cut, peeled, set into the ground. Cedar shakes she had split from the windfall in the fold. Gone in an hour because she had not latched a gate. The failure was hers. Not Farley's. Farley had lit the match, but Willa had left the door open. The lamp had shown him the shack was occupied. The open gate had drawn her outside. The sequence of causes ran backward through her own hands, her own oversight, her own divided attention. A mistake a person can trace to someone else is misfortune. A mistake a person can trace to their own hand is education. The distinction matters. Because misfortune teaches nothing, education teaches everything once. She rebuilt the woodshed in 4 days. Smaller than the first 6 feet by 8, instead of 8 by 10. The poles thicker, set deeper, braced with cross members at the base. She did not use cedar shakes for the roof. She used flat stones, laid overlapping on a frame of green poles, heavy enough that a wind could not lift them, fireproof in a way wood could never be. It was uglier than the first shed. It would last longer. She stacked the surviving cordwood inside, bark up, tight rows. She did not look at the blackened ground where the old shed had stood. A person who stares at what they have lost stops building what they need. She went down to Granger's post on the Saturday before the hearing. She did not mention the fire to Silas. She did not mention it to Beulah. She went to the land office. Josias Haverill was behind the counter, the hearing documents, arranged in 2 stacks, one for Willa, one for Nye. He looked at her hands. The blisters had broken, scabbed, begun to heal. He did not ask. The hearing is Tuesday. Judge Polk arrived yesterday. He is staying at the hotel. Has there been a letter from Laurel Station? Josias opened the mail drawer. He sorted through it with the careful fingers of a man who understands that a letter is a thing that can change a life. He closed the drawer. No letter. Willa stood at the counter. 31 days since she had sent the brown paper letter. No reply. No word from Parmelia Pellstokes. No confirmation that the letter had arrived, that Parmelia had read it, that Parmelia was coming. The margin of 7 days had collapsed. The hearing was in 3 days. Without Parmelia, Willa had filing papers, a letter from a dead woman, her own testimony. Against her, Nye had a lien instrument, a lawyer's brief filed by mail from east of the divide, the weight of a man who could afford to wind the clock. She took the room above the feed store. She ate Beulah's soup. She lay on the rope bed, in the narrow room under the eaves, staring at the ceiling boards, counting the knots in the pine the way she had once counted breaths on the ridge, in 4s, in 4s, in 4s. Tuesday morning came in clear, the kind of June morning that makes a person forget winter exists. The sky deep, the air warm, the light falling through the windows of Granger's post, with a weight that felt like gold poured from a crucible. Willa put on the cleanest dress she had. She tied her hair back with a strip of muslin. She touched the tin locket at her throat, the braided horsehair cord, the scratched D on the back, the folded paper inside with its 2 words. She walked to the land office. The room had been arranged for the hearing. Josias had moved the counter to one side, set a table at the far end, with a chair behind it for the judge. 2 benches faced the table, one for each party. The coal stove was cold, the room warm enough without it. Josias stood behind his counter, which now served as the clerk's station. His ledgers were open. His spectacles were on. His ink-stained fingers rested on the plank surface like 2 sentinels. Cresswell Nye was already seated on the right-hand bench. His coat was brushed. His beard was trimmed. His hands were folded on his knee, the posture of a man in a church he has endowed. Farley sat beside him, shoulders sloped, eyes on the floor. Behind them, standing against the back wall, a man Willa had not expected to see. Galt Tiernan. He stood with his hat in his hands, the brim turning slowly between his fingers. He did not look at Willa. He looked at the hat, at the floor, at the window, at everything in the room that was not her face. He was thinner than she remembered. Older. The 6 months since December had taken something from him that the years before had not, a certainty, perhaps, or the comfortable numbness that lets a man follow orders without asking what the orders will cost. Willa sat on the left-hand bench, alone. Judge Orrin Polk entered from the back room where he had been reviewing documents. He was a man of 60 or thereabouts, tall, spare, the kind of spare that comes from riding circuit, across a territory larger than some eastern states, sleeping in whatever bed the settlement offered, eating whatever the settlement fed him. His face was long, deeply lined, the skin weathered to the color of old harness leather. His eyes were gray, the gray of a river rock, flat, hard, patient. He wore a dark coat, no robe. He carried no gavel. He set himself behind the table, the way a man sets himself behind a workbench, without ceremony, ready to begin. He opened with the facts. A claim filed 80 years ago by Tabitha Pell Calder. A dispute filed 34 days ago by Cresswell Nye. A petition for patent filed by Willa Garrett on the basis of familial connection to the original claimant. He laid out each document as he named it, setting them on the table in a row, the way a man lays out tools before a job. Nye spoke first. His voice was level, practiced, the voice of a man who has stood in front of other judges in other rooms, making the same argument with different names. The claim had been abandoned when Tabitha Pell Calder left the ridge. No occupancy maintained in the intervening decades. No improvements, no taxes paid. Under territorial statute, approved claim unoccupied for more than 20 years reverted to public domain, subject to new filing. Nye had filed. Nye had right of first filing. In support of his filing, he presented a lien instrument, a debt of Josiah Calder's, $47, secured against the claim ground, filed in a county east of the divide. He set the lien on the table. The paper was crisp, the ink dark, the seal fresh. It looked new because it was new. Willa could see that from the bench. The paper had none of the yellowing, none of the brittleness of a document that had spent 80 years in a drawer. It had been manufactured, drafted by a clerk in a county office that had no record of Josiah Calder, no record of the debt, no connection to the claim, except the connection Nye's money had created. Judge Polk picked up the lien. He read it. He set it down. He turned to Josias Haverill. Mr. Haverill, you have kept this office for how many years? 21 years, Your Honor. In those 21 years, has any debt, lien, encumbrance, or claim of any kind been filed against the Calder patent in your records? Josias stood behind his counter. He did not hesitate. He did not consult his ledgers, because a man who has sat behind the same counter for 21 years does not need to consult what he has already read 1,000 times. No, Your Honor. No instrument of any kind. The Calder patent appears in this office exactly. Once the original filing proved complete, uncontested. No lines filed in this jurisdiction. No debts recorded. No challenges entered until 34 days ago. Judge Polk turned back to Nye. Mr. Nye, your lien was filed in a jurisdiction east of the divide. On what basis do you assert its validity over ground patented in this jurisdiction, under territorial law, by a different office? Nye shifted on the bench. The shift was small, a quarter-inch adjustment of the shoulders, the kind of movement a person makes when the chair they are sitting in has become slightly less comfortable. He recovered. He restated his position. Territorial statute, abandonment, reversion. The lien was supporting evidence, not the primary claim. The primary claim was abandonment. Polk made a note. He turned to Willa. Miss Garrett, state your claim. Willa stood. She felt the pine floor under her boots, the same pine plank that Josias swept every morning, the same wood that held the weight of every person who had stood in this room to ask for what was theirs. She spoke without hurry. She spoke the way Dorcas Pell had spoken, only when the words would carry weight. She told the judge about the filing papers found in the oilskin packet in the cellar. She told him about the letter written by Tabitha Pell Calder, dated, signed, describing the contents of the cellar, the intention to leave everything for whoever came next. She told him about Dorcas Pell, born of Kentucky people, the same Kentucky people as Tabitha, who had raised Willa 3 winters, who had taught her the skills that kept her alive on the ridge. She told him about the improvements, the patched roof, the chinked walls, the new door, the window, the woodshed, house, the pole barn, the stone scythes, the plowed meadow, the corn, the kitchen garden. She told him she had been living on the claim since December. She set the letter on the table beside the filing papers. The yellowed paper, the upright hand, the ink faded to the color of weak tea. Beside it, the crisp lean with its dark ink, its fresh seal. Judge Polk read the letter. He read it the way a person reads something written by a hand that intended to be understood across time, slowly, giving each sentence the weight the writer had given it. When he finished, he set the letter down. He looked at Willa. You claim familial connection to the feeler through the Pell name. Dorcas Pell, your guardian, shared the birth surname of Tabitha Pell Calder. Can you produce a witness to this connection? A person of the Pell line who can attest under oath. I have written to Parmelia Pell Stokes. She is the daughter of Tabitha Pell Calder's youngest sister. She lives in the low country at Laurel Station. I sent for her 31 days ago. Is she here? Willa looked at the empty bench beside her. The space where Parmelia Pell Stokes should have been sit a 72-year-old woman who had traveled by rail, by wagon, by whatever came after, across the territory, to sit on a plank bench in a land office, speak a name that connected the dead to the living. She is not here. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that is not silence, but the held breath before a sentence that will change what comes after. Nye straightened on his bench. Farley's eyes came up from the floor for the first time. Galt Tiernan's hat stopped turning in his fingers. Judge Polk picked up his pen. He began to write the preliminary note. The words that would close the hearing, with the claim unresolved, the patent denied for lack of witness. The dispute continued to the next circuit session, in October, 4 months away, 4 months, during which Nye's lawyers could file additional motions, during which the weight of paper would grow heavier, during which the clock Nye could afford to wind would tick on. The door opened. Not fast, not with drama. The door opened the way a door opens when the person behind it has been traveling for a long time, is very tired, has arrived at the place they were told to come to, does not know what they will find inside. A woman stood in the doorway. Small, 72 years old. White hair pulled back under a dark bonnet, the bonnet dusty from the road. A face that was a map of the country she had crossed to get here, the lines deep, the skin dark from sun, the eyes sharp with the particular sharpness of a person who has outlived most of the people who once told her what to do. She carried a carpet bag in one hand, a walking stick in the other. The walking stick was peeled, willow smooth from use, the kind of stick a person makes for themselves when they know they will need it for a long time. Parmelia Pell Stokes looked around the room. Her eyes moved across the benches, the table, the judge, half the counter where Josias stood. Her eyes found Willa. She walked to the left-hand bench. She sat down beside Willa. She set the carpet bag on the floor between her feet. She rested both hands on the head of the walking stick. She looked at Judge Polk with the composed patience of a woman who has traveled 800 miles by rail, by wagon, by a mail coach that broke an axle outside of Denison, by a farm cart, driven by a man who charged her 50 cents for 12 miles, by her own 2 feet, for the last 3 miles into Granger's Post, arriving not on the day she had planned, but on the day the territory required. I am Parmelia Pell Stokes. My mother was Constance Pell. My mother's eldest sister was Tabitha Pell, who married Josiah Calder, who went west in a wagon. I have come to say what I know. Judge Polk set down his pen. Parmelia opened the carpet bag. From inside it, she drew a folded piece of paper, not brown wrapping paper, not legal foolscap, but a sheet of stationery gone soft at the folds from decades of being read, put away, taken out, read again. She unfolded it on the table beside Tabitha's letter. My mother kept this. Tabitha wrote it from the settlement the day she came down out of the mountain. It arrived at my mother's house 6 weeks later. My mother read it to me when I was a girl. I have read it every year since my mother died. Judge Polk read the letter. Willa read it over his shoulder, leaning forward on the bench. the words swimming in the light from the window. Tabitha had written to her sister. She had described the shack, the cellar, what she had left behind. She had described the claim proved, filed, the papers in the oilskin. She had written, "I am leaving what I built for whoever finds it. If it is someone of our people, or someone our people raised up, then it was meant to be. I do not need a judge to decide what the mountain already knows." Parmelia named the Pell line Tabitha, Constance, herself. She named the branch that had produced Dorcas Pell, a cousin of Tabitha's, twice removed through the same Kentucky stock. She confirmed that Dorcas had raised Willa. Chain of care, not chain of blood, but a chain nonetheless, carried through hands that taught other hands, through skills passed across generations of women who understood that what you leave behind matters more than what you take with you. Judge Polk looked at the two letters on the table. Tabitha's letter from the cellar, 80 years old. Tabitha's letter to her sister, the same age, the same hand, the same ink faded to brown. He looked at the lien Nye had filed, its crisp paper, its dark ink, its seal that might as well have been stamped that morning. He looked at Nye. "Mr. Nye, I am going to ask you one question. You will answer it plainly." Nye nodded. "Who told you about the Calder claim? How did you come to know that unpatented ground existed in the upper valley, above Sparrow Ridge?" The question dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Nye's face held. His eyes did not move. But beside him, Farley shifted the unconscious movement of a man whose body knows something his mouth has been told not to say. Nye answered. He had learned of the claim through a survey of territorial records, a routine search, the kind of search his business required. He had not been directed to the claim by any specific party. Judge Polk looked at Galt Tiernan, standing against the back wall with his hat in his hands. "You. State your name, your employer." Galt Tiernan's jaw worked. The hat turned once more in his fingers. He looked, for the first time since Willa had entered the room, at her face. Whatever he saw there, or whatever he failed to see, the absence of the hatred he might have expected, the absence of the accusation he might have deserved, loosened something in him. Galt Tiernan. "I ride for Harlan Sutfield, Willow Branch. Did Mr. Sutfield direct you to deliver correspondence to Mr. Nye, or his associates?" The room waited. "Yes, regarding the Calder claim. I carried what I was told to carry. I did not read it." Judge Polk wrote for 30 seconds. The pen scratched. The room breathed. He looked up. He addressed Nye. "Mr. Nye, your lien instrument was filed in a jurisdiction with no recorded connection to the Calder estate. Your claim of abandonment is contradicted by the presence of a current occupant who has made substantial improvements to the ground since December of this year. Your assertion that no familial connection exists between Miss Garrett, the original filer, has been refuted by a living witness of the Pell line, supported by a contemporaneous letter, in the hand of the original filer, expressing intent to convey. I am setting aside the dispute. I am directing Mr. Haverill to proceed with the patent." He turned to Josias. "Issue the patent to Willa Garrett, 160 acres, timber, Meadow Creek. The claim of Tabitha Pell Calder, proved, filed, now conveyed." Josias Haverill opened the ledger. He wrote the entry in his careful, even hand. He stamped the seal. He turned the ledger toward Parmelia, who made her mark a shaky P that trembled at the downstroke but held its shape. He turned the ledger toward Willa. Willa signed her name. The pen moved across the page in the upright hand. She had schooled from Tabitha's letters, from Dorcas's 2 words, from the shape of her own life pressed into the ink. Judge Polk countersigned. The red seal went down. The wax cooled. Willa Garrett, 22, of Sparrow Ridge, was named on paper as the holder of the claim in the valley below the shack. 160 acres. Timber, Meadow Creek, patented. Free. Cresswell Nye left Granger's Post that afternoon. He rode east with Farley beside him, the 2 horses raising dust on the dry wagon track that led to the divide. He did not speak to Willa. He did not look back at the settlement. He left the way, weather leaves a valley completely, without apology, leaving only the damage behind it for other people to measure. Harlan Sutfield was never charged. The woodshed fire left no evidence. A court would accept no witness. No confession, nothing but scorched wood, the smell of kerosene in the dirt. But the stories traveled. Down the freight road, into the mercantile, through the settlements along the creek, into the low country where the cattle buyers gathered. The story of a rancher who had taken $6.60 from a hired girl's savings, sent her up a mountain to die, then hired a land speculator to steal the ground she survived on. Sutfield's name did not break. It bent the way a reputation bends when the people who trade with a man begin to look past him at the counter, begin to count their change twice, begin to remember that trust, once cracked, does not hold weight the way it used to. Galt Tiernan found Willa outside the land office after the hearing. He stood on the plank sidewalk with his hat in his hands, the same hat he had been turning in his fingers all morning. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he put the hat on his head, took it off again, held it against his chest. Miss Garrett. 2 words. Her name. Spoken in the voice of a man who had once lifted her off a horse, on a ridge above a long drop without a word, certain she would not survive the night. Spoken now to a woman standing on a sidewalk in the afternoon sun, with a paten in her hand. Alive, named, holding ground. Willa looked at him. She did not smile. She did not nod. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, long enough for him to understand that she saw him, that she remembered, that she did not forgive, because forgiveness had not been asked for, but that she did not carry him, either. He was weather that had passed over the ridge. She had other seasons to prepare for. She turned. She walked into the mercantile. She bought what she needed. She packed her goods. She started up the wagon track. Parmelia Pelstoke stayed 3 days. She slept in Beulah Crane's spare room. She rode up to the ridge with Virgil Dunmore on his next freight run, sat on the plank bunk in the shack, looked around the room, touched the pine wall with the flat of her hand. She told Willa she remembered being taken as a small girl to see Tabitha step off the train. The day she came down from the mountain, an old woman in a worn coat, hands that had finally given up their argument with iron, carrying nothing but a canvas bag. Tabitha had lived 4 more years in her sister's house, died in a bed by a south window, with the light falling across her. The way light falls across a field that has been harvested. Buried under a chestnut tree, with a plain stone. Before she left, Parmelia opened her carpetbag a second time. She drew out a length of good black wool enough for a proper winter dress. My aunt would be pleased. Willa took the wool. She held it against her chest, feeling the weight of it, the warmth already in the cloth, before it became a garment. Parmelia climbed onto Virgil's wagon. She did not look back as the wagon pulled away. She had come 800 miles to speak 6 sentences in a land office, make her mark in a ledger, give a piece of wool to a girl she had never met. She went home the way she had come, by rail, by wagon, by her own 2 feet, when the wagon could go no further. By the end of that first summer, people at Granger's Post knew Willa Garrett by name, by the shape of her work. She came down off the ridge every 3rd Saturday, with a pack on her back. She traded at Silas Fenton's mercantile. She paid in coin, in the small clean bars of yellow soap she made from rendered lard, wood ash. Silas sold the soap under a paper card that read Sparrow Ridge. He sold the dried beans the same way. By the second winter, a small trade in Willa's beans. Her yellow soap had begun to move down the wagon road, as far as the rail town in the low country. Beulah Crane walked out to meet her at the edge of Granger's Post, on the first Saturday of each month, with a pot of coffee wrapped in a folded quilt. They drank it standing by the freight scales, before Willa went into the mercantile. Neither of them spoke much. The coffee was the conversation. Theron Birch came back in October, with a padded crate in Virgil's wagon. Inside the crate, wrapped in straw, a pane of glass, proper window glass, clear enough to see the ridge through. He fitted it into the sash he had built in April, set the putty, stepped back. The north window held the glass, the way a frame holds a painting, giving the view inside it, a border, a permanence, a way of saying, this is what this room was built to see. Willa sewed the black wool dress by the north window across 4 evenings. She wore it to Granger's Post on the first Saturday of December. Silas Fenton, seeing her come through the mercantile door in her black dress, the braided horsehair cord with the tin locket at her throat, looked up from his ledger. Miss Garrett. He did not add anything to it. The name was enough. On a clear, cold evening in the 3rd winter, after she had been set down on the ridge, Willa sat at the plank table under the north window. The black wool dress hung on its peg. A mug of coffee cooled at her elbow, Coffee she had bought with coins she had earned. From beans she had grown. On ground she held by patent, in a cup Beulah Crane had given her at Christmas, without wrapping it, because Beulah did not believe in wrapping things that were meant to be used. The stove was drawing well. Bess was shut into the pole barn for the night. With a manger of hay, Theron Birch had come up in August to help scythe. The lamp on the table was a small brass kerosene lamp. Beulah had sent up in October with the wick already trimmed, the glass chimney polished. Outside the pane of glass that Theron had fitted, the snow was coming down, straight, no wind, no drift, just the steady fall of white on white, the sky giving back to the ridge what the ridge had held all summer. The lamplight fell on the pine boards of the floor, in a soft yellow square that reached almost to the seam, where the 3 short boards lay flush over Tabitha's cellar. Willa had never nailed them shut. She had sanded the edges, waxed them with tallow, fitted them back so they could be lifted with a fingernail. Below them, the 5 earthen steps still went down to the old plank door with its carved words. Go gently. The cellar held now what she kept there. Jars of good lard on the shelf, braided onions, salted cabbage in the crock from Granger's Post, the tea box with the last $22 of Tabitha's coin money. Willa had not needed to spend because her hands had earned what her hands required. On the top plank of the shelf, where Tabitha had pinned her letter 80 years before, a folded square of oilskin held a scrap of paper. On the paper, in Willa's own upright hand, 2 words. Be steady. Left for whoever came next, the way it had been left for her, the way it had been left for Dorcas, the way it had been left by women whose names she knew only in part. Kentucky women. Ridge women. Women who understood that a house is not a building, but a promise made in lumber. Seed, written words, passed forward through hands that never touch. The leather-bound ledger lay open in front of her. Every month, she wrote out what she had taken in, what she had spent. Silas Fenton had started keeping a column for her at the Mercantile GRRIT, the name written in his careful block letters, the numbers running down the page in a record of small transactions that together made a life. Willa kept her own record in the ledger Theron Birch had given her in July, the binding tight, the pages clean, the lines straight. At the bottom of each page, she wrote the same 2 words, small, in the corner. Be steady. She took the 2 papers down from the shelf above the bunk. Tabitha's letter, the ink faded, the paper softened at the folds from being read, held, folded, read again. The patent, with Josias Haverhill's careful signature, Parmelia Pell Stokes's trembling P, the magistrate's red seal. She read them both. She thought of Dorcas Pell, who had shown her how to lay a fire that would hold coals through the night, how to walk in crusted snow, how to keep her hands busy so her mind would stay whole. Dorcas had never spoken of a cousin in the mountains. She had probably never known, but Dorcas had been made by the same Kentucky people who made Tabitha, the same ground, the same hands, the same understanding that a woman who can keep herself alive can keep others alive after her, not through blood, but through teaching, through the stubborn patience of showing one pair of hands what another pair of hands already knows. Willa touched the tin locket at her throat, the braided horsehair cord, the scratched D against the pad of her thumb, the folded paper inside. 2 words written by a woman with swollen knuckles, sloping hand, who had believed that steadiness was not a quality but a practice. The way fire is not a thing but a process requiring fuel, air, attention, the willingness to tend it through the hours when no one is watching. She thought of 2 women who had shaped her life without ever being asked to. Dorcas Pell, who had raised her 3 winters, left her a locket, 2 words. Tabitha Pell Calder, who had never known her name, never seen her face, left her a house, a claim, a letter that began with 6 words carved into a door at the bottom of 5 earthen steps. 2 strangers from 2 lives, both of them wanting the same thing for a girl they would never see grow up to have a place to stand. Somewhere in the low country, Harlan Sutfield was running his ranch along Willow Branch, his reputation bending a little more each season, the way a beam bends when the weight above it shifts past what the wood can hold. Corinne Sutfield was standing in her kitchen, with her palms held steady against the cloth of her apron, the way she always stood when there was nothing left to say. Galt Ternan was drawing wages. carrying what he was told to carry, wearing the name Miss Garrett on his tongue, like a stone he could not spit out, could not swallow. Emmett Shale, if he was still alive, was 22, now the age Willa had been, when they left her on the shelf above the drop. Willa did not think of them often. When she did, she thought of them without heat, the way a person thinks of weather that has already passed over the ridge, leaving nothing behind but the ground it rained on. They had believed they were setting a girl down to disappear. What they had done instead was point her, without meaning to, without understanding what they were aiming at, toward the one door in the country that had been waiting 80 years for her hand on its latch. She closed the ledger. She wrote nothing in it that night. She banked the stove the way Dorcas had taught her. The coals raked forward. The damper turned to a quarter, the iron ticking as the heat settled into its long, slow hold. She blew out the lamp. She lay down on the plank bunk under the gray wool blanket, the darkness filling the room, the way water fills a basin from the edges inward, the last light pooling around the stove's red seam before it too went dark. She listened to the snow on the cedar shakes she had cut, split, laid with her own hands. Willa Garrett was 22 when they left her for dead, on the winter trail above Sparrow Ridge. She had $4.80 pinned inside her petticoat, a borrowed wool coat on her back, a tin locket at her throat. She walked half a mile off the ridge to a shack no one wanted, knelt on a pine floor, lifted 3 short boards with the flat end of a chipped axe. It was the best half-mile she ever walked. If this story sat with you the way certain stories do quietly, without asking permission, settling into a place you did not know was empty, share it with someone who has been counted out, who is still walking. Before you go, sit with this. Who in your own life, living or long gone, taught you the small, steady skills that carried you through a winter they never saw coming? Leave their name below. Say it once, the way Willa said Tabitha's. Let us know where you are watching from. We will see you by the next fire.